My name is Maren Whitlock. I am 31 years old, and I design events for people whose bodies need the world to make a little room. Last October, I drove 3 hours from Portland to Stonebridge Orchard for my brother's wedding with a black cane folded across the passenger seat and my grandfather's cufflinks wrapped in tissue paper inside my purse. Nolan had always loved those cufflinks when we were kids. He said they made Grandpa look like a man who knew where he belonged. I wanted my brother to carry something of that down the aisle. The orchard looked exactly the way I had drawn it. White chairs under the apple trees, low amber lights along the gravel path, a temporary ramp tucked beside the old barn. Resting chairs placed where older guests could pause without feeling like they had been parked somewhere. I noticed every detail because I had placed every detail. At the welcome table, a young attendant smiled, asked for my name, and ran her finger down the list. Then her face changed. Not dramatically. Worse. Professionally. Like someone had just found a problem she had been told not to mention. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your name was removed this morning." Before I could answer, Audra Pike, the wedding planner, stepped beside her with a clipboard pressed to her chest. Behind Audra, my parents were already watching, my mother in pale rose silk, my father in a charcoal suit, standing on the very path I had designed. "Maren," my father said, low enough to sound controlled but loud enough for cousins to hear. "You're disabled. You're not family to us anymore. Not today." My mother touched his sleeve and gave me that soft church smile. "Please don't make your brother's wedding about your condition." I looked past them at the ramp, my ramp. Then I looked at my father's polished shoes on my safe walkway. I did not cry. I did not argue. I only said, "Then don't use the space I built for you." And I turned around, not knowing yet that in less than 20 minutes, the music would stop, the ceremony would freeze, and everyone would learn whose name was really holding that wedding together. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 45%, comment 1. If it is below 45%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. The gravel sounded different when I was walking away from them. On the way in, it had been just another surface to cross, another small calculation my body made without asking permission. Weight on the right leg first. Cane down before the left. Don't rush. Don't let anyone see you count the steps. On the way out, every crunch under my shoes felt like punctuation. I made it to my car before my hands started shaking. That part matters. People think humiliation hits all at once, like a slap. It doesn't. Not for people who have spent years staying composed in rooms where they were quietly unwanted. First you get very calm. You become useful to yourself. Keys, door, seatbelt, breath. Then, once nobody can see you, your body finally tells the truth. I placed the cufflink box on the passenger seat beside my cane and sat there with the engine off. Through the windshield, I could see the orchard glowing behind the welcome tent. Every adjustment looked almost invisible now, which was the point of good access. Nobody notices safety when it works. They only notice the person whose body taught her why it mattered. My family was standing inside that design, pretending I was the thing that didn't belong. My phone buzzed once. A text from my mother. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because for 4 years, that had been the family translation for pain. Make it smaller, make it quieter, make it easier for everyone except the person carrying it. I started the car and drove out through the stone gates. I didn't go home. Portland was 3 hours away, and I wasn't ready to be alone for that long with what my father had said. I drove 15 minutes up the county road to a small overlook above the orchard, the kind tourists use for sunset pictures and locals use when they need to think, without admitting they are breaking down. From there, Stonebridge looked harmless. A pretty barn. A line of cars. Tiny guests moving under trees, unaware one crossed-out name had already started pulling the day apart. Back at the venue, June Calder was opening the white compliance folder. I didn't know that yet. I learned later how quickly things unraveled after I left. June had managed Stonebridge Orchard for 11 years. She wore reading glasses on a chain and trusted paper more than charm. While Audra moved bridesmaids around like pieces on a board, June checked permits, vendor clauses, weather plans, and liability forms. Boring things, load-bearing things. At 4:42 p.m., 18 minutes before the ceremony, June noticed the final accessibility walkthrough still had no signature. Not Audra's, not my mother's, mine. She turned back 3 pages and saw the addendum I had signed in March. Authorized Accessibility Coordinator. Maren Whitlock. Route Approval. Ramp Correction Notes. Temporary Flooring Invoice. Guest Mobility Count. 41 guests over 60. 9 guests using canes, walkers, wheelchairs, or recovering from surgery. Then June saw the updated guest list Audra had handed in that morning. My name had a clean black line through it. She called Audra first. No answer. Then my mother. Straight to voicemail. Then my father, who answered like a man annoyed by a mosquito. She's not needed, he told June. We handled it. June was quiet for 1 second. Then she said, Mr. Whitlock, you removed the only person authorized to sign off on the access route before we open it to guests. Outside, the string trio had started playing. Inside, the folder was open. For the first time that day, my name was no longer a guest problem. It was the reason the wedding could not move. 4 years earlier, before my name became something people crossed out, I was the person my company sent, when nothing could be left to chance. I was 27 then, an assistant project manager for a production company in Portland. People thought I chose flowers and tablecloths for a living. I didn't. I measured doorways, checked exits, watched weather maps, and made sure the 78-year-old aunt with a bad hip did not have to climb 3 stairs in front of 200 people pretending not to look. A beautiful event, to me, was one where nobody had to apologize for needing something. The accident happened on a wet Thursday in September 2021. I remember the sound before I remember pain. Tires tearing through rain, metal folding in on itself, a coffee cup exploding against the dash. Then a ceiling tile above a hospital bed, and my mother's voice somewhere to my left, saying, she was always such a careful driver. Like carefulness was a kind of insurance I had failed to keep current. The doctors called it nerve trauma and long-term uncertainty. My body called it fire, numbness, and learning the hallway 1 step at a time. At first, my family visited like people do when the story still looks temporary. My mother brought soup in glass containers and arranged it in the mini fridge like caregiving could be photographed. My father stood near the foot of the bed, hands in his jacket pockets, asking the therapists when I would be back to normal. Nolan came after work with sports drinks and bad jokes, and for a while I let myself believe we were still us. Then weeks became months, and the cane came home with me. That was when the air changed. At church, when Mrs. Bellamy asked how I was healing, my father answered before I could. She's getting there, he said, with a tight little laugh. We don't make a big production out of it. My mother started checking me before family dinners the way she used to check lipstick on her teeth. Is today a cane day? She would ask, smiling too brightly. Only, if you can manage without it, the pictures might look a little more natural. Natural. That word did more damage than the rain. The first time I brought the cane to Nolan's birthday dinner, he hugged me carefully, like I was made of stacked dishes. Halfway through appetizers, my father leaned close and muttered, "People keep staring." Nobody was staring. One toddler had pointed at the cane because toddlers point at everything. But my father's face had gone red, and my mother spent the rest of the meal telling relatives how brave I was in the same voice people use at funerals. I began to understand. They did not hate my pain. Not exactly. They hated what my pain announced. It told people the Whitlocks were not untouched, not sturdy, not the kind of family that handled everything privately and came to Sunday service polished clean. One afternoon, I overheard my mother in the grocery store aisle, telling a woman from choir, "Maren used to be so independent. Used to be." I stood 6 feet away, holding eggs, spinach, and a prescription, and learned something I should have learned sooner. Some families don't wait for you to recover. They wait for you to become easier to explain. I told myself it was pride at first. My father had built roofs for 30 years, and men like Russell Whitlock did not know what to do with pain they could not patch, lift, or outwork. So when he looked away from my cane, I called it old-fashioned. That was easier than admitting my father could love me, and still be embarrassed by what I had become. Then winter came, and the roofing jobs slowed down. It started with one call from my mother on a Tuesday evening while I was sitting on my apartment floor, stretching my left leg the way my physical therapist had taught me. Lorna used the voice she saved for church prayer requests and bad news. Soft, careful. Already half forgiven before she said what she wanted. "Honey, your father is under so much pressure," she told me. "It's just a timing issue. A few invoices are late. We only need a little breathing room." Breathing room. That was what my family called money when they wanted it to sound less like asking. I had received a settlement after the accident, $74,000, which looks like a fortune to people who have never watched medical bills eat in public. After the hospital, therapy, medication, a replacement car, and the months I could not work full-time, it was not a fortune. It was a raft. Small, patched, floating just enough to keep me from going under. But my mother knew the number. I had told her once while she sat beside my hospital bed, holding my hand, back when I still thought being honest with family made you safer. The first transfer was $1,200 for property taxes. My mother cried when I sent the screenshot. "You have no idea what this means," she said. I believed her. 2 weeks later, it was $870 for truck insurance because my father could not bid jobs without the truck. Then $2,400 for a supplier invoice. $3,100 to keep his business account from collections. None of it came all at once. That was the clever part about slow bleeding. You can explain each cut. I started taking smaller freelance jobs from my kitchen table. Venue maps, seating charts, emergency flow plans for nonprofit fundraisers that could barely afford me. I worked with a heating pad wrapped around my leg and a timer reminding me to stand before my hip locked. I ate soup from cans standing at the counter because sitting down meant I might not get back up before the next deadline. At Thanksgiving that year, my father stood at the head of the table in the house my money had just helped keep warm. Nolan and Tessa were there, newly dating then, sitting close enough that everyone pretended not to notice. My mother had made sweet potatoes with marshmallows because she believed tradition could cover any crack if you browned it long enough. My father lifted his glass and said, "A man takes care of his own." Everyone nodded. I looked down at my plate. My cane was hooked on the back of my chair, hidden by my coat because my mother had moved it there before dinner. Not cruelly, not exactly, just with that quick little motion she used when something made the room less pretty. A man takes care of his own. I had paid his insurance the month before. That sentence sat in my mouth like a stone, and I swallowed around it because Nolan was laughing, and for once my father looked proud without looking tired. I told myself credit did not matter. I told myself keeping the family standing mattered more than being seen holding the beam. But every transfer bought them something besides time. It bought my father his pride back. It bought my mother her story. It bought the Whitlocks one more Sunday at church where nobody had to ask how the business was really doing, or why the daughter with the cane was the only one whose apartment still had thrift store furniture. In 4 years, $29,600 left my account and entered my family under different names. God's timing, Russell's grit, Lorna's budgeting, a blessing, a lucky break, never Maren. By the time my brother got engaged, my parents had learned something dangerous. They could be ashamed of my body and still comfortable using my hands. They could pity my limp and depend on my labor. And I had taught them how. one quiet transfer at a time, until even Nolan could look at me and see only the version of his sister our parents had edited for him. By the time Nolan got engaged, my brother and I had become the kind of siblings who knew each other mostly through updates other people provided. He knew I had good days and bad days, because that was how my mother summarized a life she no longer asked about. I knew he was doing well at the mortgage office, because my father repeated it, like success needed witnesses. We were polite. Polite is what families become when somebody has been translating for too long. When we were children, Nolan was not polite with me. He was loud, loyal, and careless in the way big brothers are when they still think the world is something they can block with their own body. He carried me over puddles behind our elementary school because I hated wet socks. He called me Mare Bear until I was 13 and threatened to hide his baseball glove in the freezer. That version of him had known me before anyone explained me away. After the accident, my parents became the explanation. Maren doesn't like big gatherings anymore, my mother would say. Her pain makes plans difficult. My father preferred shorter sentences. Don't put pressure on her. It sounded protective if you didn't listen closely. That was the genius of it. They didn't say I was selfish. They said I was fragile. They didn't say I was distant. They said I needed space. And slowly, Nolan learned to stop asking me directly because he thought not asking was kindness. The first event I missed without being invited to miss was his promotion dinner. I found out from a photo online, 12 people around a long table at a steakhouse in Bend, my father's hand on Nolan's shoulder, my mother leaning toward the camera with her polished family smile. When I texted my mother, she called immediately. Oh, honey, she said. It was upstairs. We didn't want you dealing with all that. All that meant stairs, or people, or being seen. Then came Tessa's engagement brunch. I learned about that one from Aunt Celine, who sent me a heart emoji under a picture of Tessa holding a mimosa and Nolan kissing her temple. When I asked Nolan why I hadn't heard, there was a pause just long enough to tell me someone had prepared him. Mom said you were having a rough week, he answered. I was standing in my kitchen with a client floor plan open on my laptop and laundry half folded on the table. It had been an ordinary week. Painful, yes, but ordinary. Pain was not a weather emergency. It was the climate. I still lived in it. Christmas was worse because Christmas gives absence a chair. The Whitlocks took a family photo in front of the fireplace. Everyone in cream sweaters. Even Tessa. Not married in yet but already standing where I used to stand. My mother posted it with the caption, "All my heart in one room." I saw it at 11:40 p.m. after finishing a seating diagram for a retirement gala. My cane was beside the desk. My stocking, the one with my name stitched crooked in red thread, was still in a box in my closet because I had not been asked home that year until the 27th. I called Nolan 2 days later. Not my mother. Nolan. My hands were sweating so badly I had to put the phone on speaker. Did you not want me there? I asked. I tried to keep my voice even, but a question like that has bones in it. You can hear them no matter how softly you speak. He was quiet. I pictured him rubbing his thumb over his eyebrow the way he did when numbers didn't add up. Mare, he said finally, and the nickname nearly broke me. I just didn't want you uncomfortable. Did I say I would be? The silence after that was different, not empty, working. Somewhere inside it, my brother was holding 2 stories up to the light and noticing the edges did not match. Then I heard my mother's voice in the background, bright and close. Nolan, are you still on with her? His breathing changed. The moment folded itself away. I'll call you later, he said. He didn't. That was when I understood I was not losing my brother because he stopped loving me. I was losing him because love had been rerouted through people who benefited from the detour. My parents had built a version of me that was easier for Nolan to pity than to know. Fragile Maren. Difficult Maren. Maren who needed space. Maren who probably preferred not to come. So when my mother called months later asking for one small wedding favor, she was not calling the sister Nolan remembered. She was calling the quiet version of me she had trained everyone to use. My mother called in February, 3 months after Nolan proposed. and used the same soft voice that had once turned Bill's into breathing room. Maren, sweetheart, there is one tiny thing. Tiny, in my family, usually meant unpaid. Nolan and Tessa had chosen Stonebridge Orchard, an old apple farm outside Bend with a barn, a pond, and enough autumn charm to make practical people forget practical things. Then my mother lowered her voice. Tessa's grandmother uses a walker. The venue is worried about access. You know about ramps and all that. Ramps and all that. That was how my mother described the work I had rebuilt my life around. I had spent 2 years learning how to make beautiful spaces stop humiliating people. Gravel could trap walker wheels. Low light could turn one step into a threat. A bad ramp could make an 82-year-old woman feel like cargo being moved through a side entrance. I asked whether Nolan knew she was calling me. My mother paused half a second too long. Everyone just wants the day to be easy, she said. I should have said no. But then Lorna sent me a photo of Alma Granby, Tessa's grandmother, standing beside a rosebush in a lavender cardigan, both hands resting on a silver walker. Alma had nothing to do with my parents. She had not edited me out of Christmas or called my cane a complication. She was just an old woman who wanted to watch her granddaughter get married without needing 3 people to apologize her across a lawn. So I said I would look at the venue. I drove to Stonebridge on a cold Thursday morning and met June Calder at the barn. She shook my hand, looked at my cane once, and then looked at my face. I noticed that. People think we don't. We do. June walked me through the property with a white folder under her arm, while Audra Pike followed behind us in cream boots that had never met mud. Audra kept saying words like rustic flow and visual softness. I kept looking at the ground. The problems were everywhere once you knew how to see them. The gravel path was too deep. The barn threshold would catch a walker. The restroom route dipped behind a hedge and went dark after sunset. The aisle was beautiful from a photographer's angle and careless from a human one. I took measurements, asked about temporary flooring, ramp grade, handrail placement, chair spacing, and where Alma could rest without feeling parked. Audra smiled each time like I was ruining a painting with math. By the end of the walkthrough, I had a full redesign in my notebook. Not dramatic, not ugly, just thoughtful. A safer path from parking to orchard, low glare lighting, resting chairs that looked intentional. A ramp beside the barn without hiding the people who needed it. June understood immediately. Audra understood the invoice. My mother, when I called her that night, understood only the part that mattered to her. That's wonderful, she said. We'll keep your involvement simple, so nobody feels awkward. Nobody. That word did a lot of work. Over the next 6 weeks, I corrected layouts for my kitchen table, reviewed rental quotes, marked turning radius diagrams, and argued for temporary flooring that would not sink under walker legs. When Audra said the budget was tight, I paid deposits myself so the equipment would not be released to another event. $11,400 left my account under the label accessibility hold. I thought I was making room for Alma. I did not understand yet that I was also building the perfect excuse to keep myself outside the picture. 3 weeks before the wedding, Audra accidentally sent me the wrong email thread. I know people like to believe truth arrives with thunder, but most of the time it comes quietly, at 1:18 inches the morning, while your heating pad is cooling against your leg, and your laptop screen is the only light in the room. The subject line was simple: Visual Concerns Whitlock, Granby Wedding. I opened it because I thought it was about chair spacing. For 2 seconds I was still a professional. Then I saw my name. Audra had written, "The accessible adjustments are functional, but we need to keep the visual tone elevated. If Maren attends with visible mobility equipment, it may shift guest attention away from the couple." Under that, my father had replied, "Nolan deserves one day that isn't about her condition." My mother's answer sat below his like lace over a knife. "Maren is sensitive. We can tell her the crowd would be too much. She'll understand if we frame it gently." I read the thread once, then again. Then a third time, slower, because some sentences are so ugly your mind tries to protect you by making them look unreal. Audra added one more note near the bottom. We're curating an atmosphere. A visible medical situation changes the tone. There it was, dressed in expensive language. My body was not a body to them. It was a tone issue, a visual concern, something to manage between flowers and lighting. I looked at the open layout on my screen. Accessible path to ceremony lawn. Rest stop near the second apple tree. Walker clearance beside row 1. Low glare lights at restroom turn. Ramp grade corrected to reduce strain. Every note came from a life they wanted hidden. My limp had taught me where people get tired. My cane had taught me which surfaces lie. My pain had taught me that dignity is often lost in small design choices before anyone says a cruel word out loud. My phone was beside the laptop. I opened Nolan's contact and typed, "Did you know they don't want me there?" I watched the sentence sit in the message box, small and dangerous. If I sent it, Tessa might cry. Nolan might call our mother. Alma's access plan might become a family fight instead of a finished route. That was how the trap always worked. The truth never arrived alone. It arrived carrying consequences, and somehow I was always asked to carry those too. So, I deleted the message. Not because they deserved my silence, because Alma deserved the path. Because Tessa deserved a grandmother who could move through her wedding without fear. Because some old part of me still believed love meant absorbing the damage quietly so the day could stay pretty for everyone else. I closed the email, saved the layout, and sent Audra the corrected ramp measurements at 1:46 a.m. She replied at 7:03. Perfect. This will photograph beautifully. That was the moment. Something in me went still. Not angry. Colder than angry. They were not ashamed to use what my body had taught me. They were only ashamed to be seen with the body that taught it. A week before the wedding, Tessa texted me for the first time without my mother attached to the conversation. I was at my kitchen table, reviewing a lighting rental invoice Audra had marked urgent, when my phone lit up. "Hi Maren, it's Tessa. I heard you helped a little with the access stuff." "Thank you." That was all. One polite sentence, one cautious bridge. I stared at it longer than the words required, because when you have been explained away for years, even a small direct message feels like someone knocking on a boarded window. I typed 3 different answers and deleted all of them. The truth was too large for a thank you text, and I had become too practiced at making large things fit inside small rooms. Finally, I wrote, "I'm glad your grandmother won't have to choose between dignity and attending." I almost deleted that too. It sounded too honest, but I let it go, and for the first time in months, I did not soften the sentence for my mother's comfort. Tessa did not answer right away. 3 dots appeared, vanished, appeared again. Then she wrote, "Did you meet Alma?" I looked at the question and felt the whole room sharpen. Not because it was dangerous by itself, but because it meant Tessa had noticed something. I replied, "No. I just read her notes carefully." That was true. Alma's notes had come through June in practical fragments. Walker width. Hip replacement. Fatigue after standing. Pride. That last one was not written anywhere, but I had read it anyway. Later, Tessa told me she opened the access plan again after that. Not the polished vendor copy with Audra's logo, but the marked version June had sent with comments still visible in the margins. She saw what Audra had been calling flow and what I had actually built. A resting chair under the second apple tree, close enough to the aisle that Alma would not feel exiled. A front row space wide enough for a walker, but not separated like a medical accommodation. A restroom route lit gently, not dramatically, because safe light is different from pretty light. Small choices. Human choices. That evening, Tessa asked Nolan why I was not more involved. I know this because he called me and did not say hello properly. He said, "Did you and Tessa talk today?" His voice had that careful edge people get when a story they have been handed starts leaking. I said, "She thanked me." He waited. I waited too. Then he said, "Mom said you only gave a few suggestions." I looked at the stack of invoices beside my laptop, The diagrams, the notes, the folder marked Stonebridge Final. Is that what you believe? I asked. There was silence. Not the empty kind. The working kind again. Then Nolan exhaled. I don't know what I believe anymore. It was not an apology. It was not even courage. But it was the first honest sentence my brother had given me in a long time, and I hated how much it still mattered. Before I could answer, I heard Lorna in the background, bright as a bell. Nolan, honey, we need you for the seating chart. His voice changed. I'll call you back, he said. He didn't call back. But the next morning, Tessa did. This time she did not text. She called while I was measuring a revised aisle clearance on my screen. Maren, she said, and her voice was quiet in a way that made me sit still. Did you really only give a few suggestions? There are questions that ask for information, and there are questions that ask permission to stop believing a lie. This was the second kind. I closed my laptop halfway, not all the way. Some part of me was still afraid of abandoning the work. I told her, I helped where I could. It was the smallest, truthful answer I could give. Tessa was silent. And then she said, That's what everyone keeps doing, answering around you. I did not know what to say to that. Nobody in my family had ever named the shape of the room that clearly. Then she added, Alma cried when she saw the front row space. She said somebody understood she wanted help, not a spotlight. I had to put my hand flat on the table. Not because I was weak, because sometimes being seen lands harder than being insulted. I wanted to tell Tessa everything. The email thread, the money, my name being kept off the work. But I thought of Alma, of Nolan, of a wedding already loaded with other people's expectations, and I stopped at the edge of the truth. Your grandmother deserves a beautiful day, I said. Tessa answered. So do you. Then she hung up, and for the first time, the story my parents had built had a crack wide enough for daylight. The night before the wedding, Tessa's uncle Bishop Hale raised a glass at the rehearsal dinner and said something that should have been harmless. He was 68, a retired county judge with silver eyebrows and the kind of voice that made rooms behave. To Alma, he said, looking toward Tessa's grandmother. Tomorrow, she gets to watch her granddaughter marry without being treated like a problem. Whoever planned that access route understood more than logistics. People clapped softly. Alma dabbed her eyes. Audra smiled with all her teeth. My mother, I was told later, did not clap until everyone else did. I was not at that dinner. Immediate family only, my mother had said, which was a funny phrase by then. But later, Tessa told me the air changed after Bishop's toast. She looked at Audra across the table and asked, lightly enough for politeness, Was Maren more involved than you said? Audra adjusted the napkin in her lap. She offered some input, she said. We refined it. Refined. Another clean word used to cover fingerprints. My mother heard that question. That mattered more than anything Audra said. Lorna Whitlock had spent years surviving by noticing when a room began to turn toward the truth. A bill on a counter. A photo without me in it. Nolan asking why I had not come. Tessa asking who really designed the path. To other people, those were small things. To my mother, they were alarms. By the time dessert plates were cleared, she was already smiling too hard. The next morning at 8:06, she texted me. Running behind today, maybe arrive quietly after the ceremony starts. Crowds will be easier then. Love you. I read it while sitting on the edge of my bed in Portland, my navy dress hanging from the closet door. I had already packed the cufflinks. I had already checked the weather in Bend twice. Arrive quietly, after the ceremony starts. In other words, come late enough that no one has to decide where to put you. I did not answer. I steamed my dress. I took my medication with toast because pain pills on an empty stomach are a rookie mistake. I put my cane by the door, where I could not pretend I had forgotten it. Then I drove east through pale October light, not to confront anyone, not to ruin anything, but to see whether my family would really do what their email thread had already promised. At 9:12 that morning, Audra sent the updated guest list to the check-in staff. I would learn the time later from June's records. One line removed. No explanation typed into the notes. Just my name gone cleanly from a day my hands had helped build. My mother called it protecting Nolan. Audra called it preserving atmosphere. My father would later call it necessary. But names do not disappear just because frightened people drag a cursor across them. Some names are written in other places. Some are waiting inside folders nobody glamorous bothers to read. By the time I reached the Overlook, the version of me on the guest list was already gone. I did not know June Calder had found the other version yet. The one in black ink, the one attached to clauses, invoices, measurements, and liability. I was sitting in my car with the engine off, watching the orchard below shrink into something pretty and distant, when June opened the compliance folder and saw what Audra had tried to erase from the wrong piece of paper. The first page was ordinary enough. Vendor contacts, weather plan, emergency numbers. Then June turned to the accessibility section and stopped. Authorized Accessibility Coordinator, Maren Whitlock. My signature was under it, dated in March. Below that were the final route design, temporary flooring notes, ramp grade correction, guest mobility count, and the clause Audra had apparently treated like decoration. Any removal or substitution of the authorized coordinator required written release before the access route could open to guests. June called Audra first. Audra was outside, arranging bridesmaids near the orchard fence, holding a headset to one ear, and pretending control was the same thing as competence. She didn't answer. June called my mother next, straight to voicemail. Then she called my father, who was already standing near the ceremony lawn, accepting handshakes like the father of the groom was a public office. "Mr. Whitlock," June said, "we have a problem with the access approval." My father sighed. "If this is about Maren, she's not needed." June later told me she looked down at the folder before answering, just to make sure she stayed polite. "Sir, your daughter is the only person authorized to sign off before we open that route to guests," my father said. "The planner handled it." June said, "The planner removed her." There was a pause then, not long, but enough. The kind of silence that happens when a lie steps on a floorboard and hears the wood crack underneath it. By then, the string trio had begun looping the prelude. Guests shifted in white chairs under the apple trees. 41 of them were over 60. 9 had mobility notes in the plan. Alma Granby sat inside the bridal suite with her walker beside her, and no idea that the path made for her had become the one thing holding the wedding still. Outside, Audra finally saw June crossing the courtyard with the white folder and went pale under her makeup. Nolan intercepted them near the barn, because grooms notice when venue managers walk fast. "Is something wrong?" he asked. June did not soften it. "Your sister was removed from the guest list this morning. She is also the authorized coordinator on the access plan. Without her final approval, we cannot open the ceremony route." Nolan looked at Audra. Audra looked at the folder. My mother appeared behind them with a smile already forming, the kind she used before she knew what truth had entered the room. Tessa came out last, half-dressed in white, one earring in, the other still in her hand. She heard June say my name. Then she saw the paperwork. My name on every page. Not as a suggestion. Not as input. As the person who had made the day possible for the people who needed room to arrive safely, Tessa looked at Nolan first, then at my mother. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. "Why is your sister's name on my grandmother's access plan?" Nolan called me first. I watched his name glow on my phone while the orchard sat below me, small and golden and far too beautiful for what had just happened there. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could still hear my father's voice at the welcome table. "You're disabled. You're not family to us anymore. Not today." Some sentences do not end when people stop speaking them. They keep walking around inside you, opening doors. I let Nolan's call go to voicemail. That was not revenge. It was survival. If I answered him first, I knew he would come wrapped in confusion, guilt, and whatever version of the story my mother had already handed him. I did not have the strength to sort my brother from their voices yet. Then the phone rang again. Same venue number. Not Nolan this time. I knew, because the caller ID showed Stonebridge Orchard. When I answered, Tessa's voice came through, thin and shaking. Maren, it's me. Please, don't hang up. Behind her, I could hear music looping, muffled voices, the strange public quiet of people waiting for something they do not understand. I closed my eyes. Tessa, you should be getting married right now. She gave one short breath that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. That's the problem. I just found out whose name is on my grandmother's access plan. I did what I had been trained to do. I tried to make myself smaller. Today is about you and Nolan, I said. Go have your ceremony. We can talk later. Tessa cut me off, not loudly, but with something steadier than volume. No, that is what everyone keeps asking you to do. Later. Quietly. Around the edges. The car went silent around me, except for my own breathing. Then she said, My grandmother is standing in her dress because of you. Please don't let them make your kindness invisible too. For a moment I could not answer. The overlook blurred. Not from tears exactly, but from the effort of holding too many years still at once. Then another voice came on the line, older and rougher, with the dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching children to sit up straight. Maren, this is Alma Granby, she said. I do not know what they told you about your body, but I know what your work gave mine. My hand tightened around the phone. Alma continued, slow and clear. You did not build ramps, child. You built dignity. That was the sentence that moved me. Not the contract. Not the liability. Not even the thought of my parents being exposed. Dignity. The thing I had been trying to protect for strangers, for elders, for everyone except myself. I looked at my cane on the passenger seat, then at the cufflink box beside it. If I stayed gone, my family would find a way to use that too. They would call me overwhelmed, difficult, too emotional. They would turn my leaving into one more proof that I did not belong. I started the car with my left hand still shaking. Tell June I'm coming back, I said. And for the first time in years, I was not returning to be useful. I was returning to be seen. The drive back took 15 minutes. It felt longer because every mile asked me the same question. Who are you going to be when you walk through that gate again? The woman they could use and hide? Or the woman whose name was already in the folder? When I pulled into Stonebridge the second time, the gravel did not sound like punctuation anymore. It sounded like a door unlocking. June Calder was waiting at the welcome table. She did not look at the guest list. She turned the white folder toward me and said, Miss Whitlock, we need your final approval. No sweetheart. No honey. No family favor. Miss Whitlock. I took the pen and signed where June pointed. My hand shook once, but the signature was clean. Behind her, Audra stood near the barn, headset still on, face tight with the panic of a person learning that polish does not outrank paper. We should move forward quietly, she said. Guests don't need details. Bishop Hale stepped beside Alma's walker and looked at Audra the way judges look at bad arguments. Guests don't need gossip, he said, but they should know who made room for them. Tessa did not make a speech. She did something better. She changed the procession. Instead of having my father escort Alma to the front row, she asked me to walk with her grandmother down the path I had designed. Alma placed one hand on her walker, and the other lightly around my arm. I had a cane in my right hand. She had her silver walker. We moved slowly beneath the apple trees, while 146 people watched two bodies, my family would have called inconvenient, make their way through a wedding without apology. Halfway down the aisle, we passed my parents. My father looked at the ground. My mother had one hand pressed to her mouth, but for once, no useful sentence came out of it. Alma paused just long enough for them to hear her. A family that hides the person who made room for everyone else, she said, has misunderstood the word family. Then we kept walking. After the ceremony, Nolan found me near the edge of the orchard. He did not say he didn't know. That would have been too easy. He said, I should have asked you myself. It was the first apology that sounded like responsibility instead of weather. Tessa stood beside him and said my parents would tell the whole truth after the honeymoon. Every email, every invoice, every time my name had been kept off the work. June ended Stonebridge's vendor relationship with Audra before the reception was over. I did not hug my parents that night. Healing is not a photograph people take after the truth comes out. It is slower than that. I told them plainly, I am done doing invisible favors. If my work helps this family, my name stays on it. If my body embarrasses you, you don't get access to my hands, my money, or my silence. My mother cried. My father said nothing. For once, silence belonged to me. 3 months later, Tessa mailed me a framed photo from the wedding. It was not of the kiss or the first dance. It was the orchard path at sunset, low lights glowing, ramp tucked beside the barn, Alma's walker beside my cane in the frame. On the back, Tessa had written, "You were always on the path." I keep it by my desk now, where I design spaces for people who have been told they take up too much room. My family was ashamed of my cane until they needed the path I built. But real family does not hide your body. Real family makes room for your whole truth. There is a kind of silence that looks like love from the outside. It lets other people keep smiling. It keeps dinner peaceful. It protects the wedding day, the holiday photo, the family reputation, the person who says they didn't mean it that way. For a while, silence can feel noble. It can feel like strength. It can feel like you are choosing grace over conflict. But silence has a cost. When you keep your love invisible for too long, someone else may turn it into absence. When you hide your sacrifice to protect someone's pride, they may start believing they carried the weight alone. When you keep shrinking your pain so the room stays comfortable, the room learns to exist without making space for you. Maren's story is not only about a wedding, it is about every person who has ever been useful but unseen. Every daughter who paid the bill but was left out of the picture. Every sibling who stayed quiet to keep peace and was later called distant. Every person whose body changed, whose life became harder, and who still had to comfort the people embarrassed by that change. Real family does not require you to disappear so they can feel whole. Real love does not use your hands and hide your face. Real belonging does not depend on whether your body is easy to explain, your pain is convenient, or your presence fits the picture. The lesson is simple, but it takes some of us years to learn. Love should be kind, but it should not be invisible. Help people, yes. Forgive when you can. Make room for others. But do not keep giving your labor, your money, your silence, and your dignity to people who only value you when your name is not attached. Sometimes healing begins with one sentence spoken plainly. Sometimes it begins with signing your own name. Sometimes it begins with walking back through the gate, not to beg for a place, but to show everyone you were part of the foundation all along. If this story reminded you of someone who was erased while holding a family together, leave their name in the comments. And if you believe quiet people deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel. More stories are coming.